Welcome to the Mental Health Market Update, where we talk about what's happening in the mental health industry. Here's your host, Stephen Hayes.
Welcome back to another episode of the Stigma Podcast. Today is a mental health market update. It's May 29th, 2020, and we're going to talk about who are the investors backing mental health startups and how much funding has been placed into this space so far in Q2 2020. So let's start with who's investing. When I first set out to invest in the mental health startup space, I started by mapping the landscape of startups. This included identifying as many startups in the space as I could. A byproduct of that effort was a list of investors who had backed those companies. In early 2019, as my list of startups grew from 100 to a couple hundred to 500 and then to over 1,000, so did my list of investors who had participated in the space. If you asked me to guess the number of investors who had funded mental health startups back in early 2019, there's no way I could have come anywhere near the over 900 investors that I've found that have invested in this space so far. I wrote a blog post about this a few months ago, but today I wanted to dig in and provide a little more color on my findings, updates on my findings, and I'll conclude with a quick summary of key funding rounds that have announced in the market so far in Q2 2020. Let's start with the list of investors. So far, I've identified 912 investors that have placed capital into a mental health startup. I'm sure I'm missing some. There's no way to come up with a perfect list here, but 912 is what I've found so far. We have prepared a detailed list of these investors, including what they have invested in within this space, in a Google Sheet, which you can find a link to in the show notes and on our website. Of those 912 who have invested, 55% of them, just over half, are traditional venture capital funds. The second biggest group are angel investors, comprising of about 25% of the investor population in the space. After that, I see about 5% of the investors as accelerators, 2 to 3% private equity funds, and the rest scattered among small numbers of nonprofits, hedge funds, strategics, family offices, banks, universities. I've even found talent agencies and REITs investing in the space. I've broken my list down into a total of 22 investor types. That number surprised me. I didn't realize it'd be that many. One of the most interesting statistics to me is the number of investors that have invested in more than one mental health startup. When I originally published this list, that number was 113 just a few months ago. Now the number is 145 investors that have invested more than once into startups in this space. The number of investors who are making their second and third investments in the space is very telling to me. This indicates that investors who have dipped their toe into this market have liked what they've seen and are coming back for more. This doesn't surprise me when I zoom out and look at the broader capital raising dynamics in the space so far this year. So far in 2020 through May 29th, we've identified nearly 60 funding rounds, totaling over $850 million invested in mental health startups. This already exceeds the highest estimate we had for 2019 total funding in the space, which ranged, based on what I've seen in other people's work from last year, that ranged between $500 million and $750 million. I detailed this recently in a blog post about Q1 2020 funding, which you can find in our show notes linked here. So let's take a look at the latest noteworthy deals in the market, specifically those that have closed in the last 60 days inside of Q2 2020. The biggest deal in the market so far in Q2 has been the $80 million funding raised by Compass Pathways. You may be saying, but what about the Mindstrong deal? Yeah, that was announced a couple weeks ago, but it actually closed in March. So it's a Q1 deal on my list. So be careful. Don't double count that if you're keeping track of this at home. Compass Pathways raised $80 million in a Series B in April from some top-tier investors, including Founders Fund, Atai Life Sciences, which is a vehicle that Peter Thiel, Thiel Capital, and a handful of angels and founders have placed capital in, which invested into Compass. Another notable deal this quarter was the Sondermind Series B. They raised $27 million. It was led by General Catalyst and had participation from F Prime Capital, Jonathan Bush, and a few others. Sondermind is led by Mark Frank. He's a fellow West Point graduate and someone I view as very knowledgeable in the mental health space. If you're a founder and you're looking for someone with great connectivity in the space to provide advice, I'd recommend reaching out to Mark. One more deal that I'll mention in a little bit of detail is the Vita Health round from late April, where they raised $25 million, and that capital came from Workday Ventures, NGP Capital, Canvas Ventures, Aspect Ventures, as well as investment vehicles run by Frank Yu and Jerry Yang. Now, briefly, I'll point out a few other somewhat larger deals that happened in this space so far this quarter. Now, I've obviously left out the Omada Health raise. They raised $57 million. I didn't forget about it. That capital was raised to fund an acquisition. Nothing wrong with that. Honestly, Omada is a grown-up. I think of them as a mature company in the space, but I certainly want to note that they did raise a lot of capital, and it was for an acquisition. A couple other deals. Mindler, based in Sweden, raised $8 million in April. Limbix raised $9 million from Sequoia and others in May. Monument raised a $7.5 million seed round. That's a big seed round. And you might be wondering, well, why can't I raise a $7.5 million seed round? Now, founder Mike Russell is a very experienced founder. He's made money for his investors in the past, and the cap table is comprised of those investors that he made money for in the past. He's also incredible at positioning and selling. So I like Mike. I like what he's doing. And I like the way he builds and grows and gets businesses funded. I think that they will do well, and I hope they do well. There are a number of other investments made so far this quarter as well. We are keeping a list, and we'll be happy to share that list with people if you're interested. At the end of the quarter, we will publish a deeper dive into the funding in the space as well, with a list showing all of the data that we can share publicly, because some of our data, it comes from people trusting us and giving us information that they've asked us to keep private. So we obviously will never disclose that detail. So wrapping up, I think it's safe to say that capital flows into the mental health startup space are accelerating. We are seeing this in the number of investors coming to the space, the investors who are doubling down with incremental exposure, and the total dollars as well as total number of deals being announced. While we hear a lot of talk out there about venture capital investors slowing down during COVID, they certainly have not slowed down within the mental health space. I actually think there are a bunch of funding rounds hiding out there. And what I mean by that is those are rounds where the founders have raised, but they have not announced this quarter for a number of reasons, including perception during what we would all agree is trying times. So I think my numbers here are actually rather conservative. The market is bigger and growing faster than we can even measure. The data points we do have really point to this trend, even though we can't say for sure that we've mapped the entire space. I don't think our data is perfect. That's basically what I'm saying. I don't think anyone's is. You can't just run a search in PitchBook or Crunchbase to track a nascent market like this. You have to compile this data from, yes, those sources, of course, but from press releases and from relationships with angel investors and founders and other VCs who are willing to tell you and trust you because they know you'll keep the information private. Anyway, that's it for this week's quick mental health market update. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting us. We have recently launched a Patreon account where supporters can find deeper insights, resources, some of our source links, research reports that we've used to develop our opinions, and more detailed written analysis of the things we cover in these market updates. I'd love to have you support us there as we continue to bring market insights and share learnings with you. I'll link to that in the show notes. Another thing we're offering to our supporters is a monthly Ask Me Anything Zoom call where we will answer questions about our market research, talk about fundraising, provide advice, and give feedback. These calls are a great networking tool for people interested in this space as well. Let us know if you want to participate. Finally, we want to hear from you. What did you like? What do you want to hear more of? What do you disagree with? How else can we be helpful to you as you build solutions in this space that will be there to help other people? You can find us on Twitter at StigmaCast. You can find us on Instagram at Stigma Podcast. And you can always email us directly, info@stigmapodcast.com. And until next time, stay safe, be well, and thank you for listening.